So, given the choice of what to work on before this conference, I have a little less time than I used to have. I have a new job. I used to be an independent consultant, which meant that I got to choose how I spend my days. Now I have a real job. It's full-time, which means I have a little less time. And since I had a little less time before this release, I had to be a bit selective about what I did. And I hope that you will all agree that it seemed to me to be prudent to prioritize our documentation and actually getting the documentation for the release finished beforehand. What that meant is that I didn't have time to create some slides for this talk. So I'm going to fake it with some browser tabs, and I hope that's enough. So what I want to talk about today is just a little bit about what's changed in the documentation since last we met, or for those of you maybe who weren't here last time, just things that have changed in the documentation recently. Jarno talked about recent changes in the toolkit. I'll talk a little bit about the documentation because that's the area of the project that I work on most. So you're familiar with this site. You're probably familiar with this documentation in some way, shape, or form. If you're here. And one of the areas that we've changed in the documentation is because Jarno has been working so hard on the Markdown support with his Markdown plugins, we have done our best to integrate that work into the documentation for the toolkit itself. So one of the things that we typically do is when there's a new version or a new feature in DITA, maybe the 2.0 specification adds an element or something like that, then Jarno, of course, will implement processing for that. And then we typically try to include that in the documentation, just because there aren't other test cases out there in the world for these things that don't exist yet. So sometimes our documentation is a little bit the sort of proverbial canary in the coal mine, trying to figure out whether this actually works. And that can be sometimes a little bit frustrating because leading up to a release, when time is tight, we need to get the documentation finished. But using those new features sometimes reveals that things don't quite work as intended, or they work better than intended, or whatever. So there's a bit of testing that goes on, and I sometimes wish that we had a dedicated quality assurance person on the team whose job it was to test these things so that I could just write the docs and be done with it. But we don't have that luxury. So if any of you has a part of their heart that beats for integration and unit tests and quality assurance and things like that, and you just don't know what to do with your nights and weekends, we have suggestions for you. So please let us know. Sorry, that was just a shameless pitch for assistance here. There are only 3 of us. To get back on topic, Markdown. So Markdown support in the toolkit has improved, and we're integrating that in the docs. So what seemed to make sense was the parts of the documentation that describe the Markdown support in the toolkit should themselves be Markdown. Right, so that's what we're looking at here is a particular just section of the documentation that describes the Markdown support. So the Markdown DITA syntax, the MDITA syntax, a little bit of a comparison between the formats and things like that. So we realized that it's kind of silly to author these topics in XML DITA and talk about how Markdown works. We should just be authoring them in Markdown. And so that made sense from a strategic perspective, the testing perspective that I talked about before. But also the other issue that I raised, the fact that I just don't have much time anymore, and I'm lazy. So I realized, wait a minute, Jarno has been working on this stuff for a long time. He's got a wiki in the plugin repository that already has this information. Why duplicate that when we can just copy it? So this is the GitHub repository for the plugin, where Jarno has been working on this stuff for the longest time. Yes?
That's the wrong page.
Oh, you think so? Oh, yes, it is. That was good. Thank you for pointing that out, Jarno. Yeah. Okay, this is still true. Hang on a sec. Let me go back. Let's do this. Instead of that, let me go to the documentation here. Customizing PDF themes. There we go. Okay, now we're on the right page. Okay, so this is actually true for both of these sections. So good catch, Jarno. Both the Markdown reference stuff and the PDF theme support are generated from plugin wiki content. And that actually reminds me that I probably should talk more about the PDF themes, but I talked about them last year. So if you weren't here last year, ask. But at any rate, section of the documentation generated from Markdown, GitHub repository wiki, which means that people can edit this content theoretically without any knowledge of DITA. The legions and hordes of people that contribute to this plugin, whenever they make changes, can update the documentation themselves in the wiki. That's a joke because Jarno's the only one that works on it. But theoretically, right, it would make it easy for people to contribute to this content. And the only reason I'm mentioning all of this is not just to make you pity us, but because this is a use case that many teams have, right? Content in DITA is difficult for other authors to work on. And so sometimes we get pushback in our organization saying, why are you using this arcane XML technology that no one likes using? You would get more contribution in your documentation if you had your content in an easier to author format, right? So this is just a solution to that problem. And the way that we do this, we're not copying and pasting things back and forth because that's not the right way to do things either. But fortunately, in these docs as code workflows with Git, GitHub, and things like that, there are tools that we can use for things like this. And people know that there may be within Git multiple ways of pulling things in from external repositories. There are things called submodules and stuff like that. When you use that word in developer circles, some people will say, ooh, don't use submodules. They're complicated or something like that, right? But there's a few other approaches. And one of them is called subrepo or subrepositories. And this is something that I've found quite useful here. So this gets a little bit nerdy for a moment. But this is basically a different way of integrating the content of one Git repository in another, in a way that users don't need to know about. So basically what this tool does is you give it the Git URL for one repository. It takes all of that content, pulls it in, makes a copy in a subfolder of your repository, and you can work on it there as if it lived there, right? And so in this main repository for the docs, when I pull in Jarno's changes from the plugin wiki, I can do my editorial changes to that, extend some things, change some things within the context of the documentation project. I don't need to go to the wiki and do it there. And then when I've got things in the shape that I'd like them to be, and it looks good and works well in our docs, I can press another button to send all of that content back to the wiki. So that's just a workflow that works well for us in this particular context. It requires a certain bit of knowledge about the way these things are wired together. But if that's a problem that you have in your projects and are curious about this, feel free to ask. I'm happy to show you and explain how this works. Not in the context of this presentation, but just as a tip, that's a useful thing to do, and it's worked quite well for us over the last year or two. So what's next? How do we bring that in? This is just a markdown, standard DITA map. So all we have here are topic references that just pull in those markdown topics, right? So what we see here are key references. I'm not doing file-based references there. If I had href attributes in here with file extensions, there would be someone in the back row saying, boo, you're doing it wrong, must use keys for everything. So in this context, I want to make sure that I don't get booed, so keys, right? But that's all that's going on here. There's nothing really more exciting than that. It's just a standard DITA map. So that's the way that works. Astute observers might notice that this is an XML map. And didn't he just say that he was using markdown features for the markdown stuff? And didn't Jarno say that markdown maps are a thing? Why am I not using a markdown map here? Right? We're back to the canary in the coal mine thing. When markdown maps were introduced, they were being prepared for a certain version of the toolkit, right? That would add this support. But as we build the documentation during the release cycle, we need a stable version of the toolkit and not the latest bleeding edge of the development branch, right? That has these new features. So I couldn't use a Markdown map to document the Markdown stuff until the Markdown map support landed in a released version of the toolkit, which is what we use to build the documentation. So I hope you will forgive me for using a bit of XML when we're talking about Markdown, but in terms of ideas for what's next, this section should one day be a Markdown map itself. And then I woke up one morning realizing, oh my goodness, it's not a Markdown map yet, and we're going to talk to these people about all the cool new things that we're doing. I'm embarrassed that this is not a Markdown map. And then I said I should just make it one and then pull it in. And then we realized, oops, we don't support Markdown maps as submaps yet. So I believe that has been changed. Or is in progress or something like that. But at the time we were doing this, that wasn't possible yet. So if you had a really simple project with 10 topics, you could create a really simple Markdown map and then build output from that, and everything was fine. But if you have a more complex project like this with 3 or 4 layers of nested submaps that call other submaps and things like that, that doesn't work yet. But it will probably soon. So that's kind of the plan there. So that's one of those things that's changed. One of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about is just some ideas we have for what could we change about the documentation. What else could we do? I think I've been working on this for about 10 years now, and sometimes it's hard to come up with new ideas. One thing that made it easy for me to contribute early on was I had been working with the toolkit for a while. And struggling with the documentation sometimes because I didn't understand things. So of course I fixed the things that I found confusing at first. But now I've been working on this for so long that I can't see the forest for the trees anymore. So sometimes I'm not quite sure what to put time into that would make your lives easier when you're working on the documentation or using the documentation. But one of the things that has occurred to me is that our navigation hierarchy is rather complex. We have a bunch of, let's see, go back to that. A bunch of top-level topics there. And if you just look at the very top level of that, there's a lot to digest there, and there's lots of words there. And sometimes it's hard to figure out where is the information I'm looking for. And in my day job now, I wear a different hat. I work now as a content designer. Some people call that UX writer. So I'm more focused on the words in the user interface. And if I put on that hat and look at this documentation that I have been ostensibly responsible for recently, there's a lot of words there. And I could probably simplify those words like I do in my day job. So that's one way I'm thinking about this is could we make this a little bit more digestible, accessible on the top level, maybe a little simpler. And all of us that write documentation, build documentation, websites, use documentation for the projects that we use in our daily work, are probably familiar with multiple different approaches for how you present information, right? So there's lots of ideas about that. And one metaphor is to kind of split things out on a top level to reduce the complexity of the navigation within those sections, right? So that might be an idea here, would be to maybe reduce the number of top level sections and then make the navigation within those sections a bit simpler. Because maybe someone that is extending the toolkit and writing plugins has a different need. Like they might want to see different information than a first-time user who just needs to install the thing, right? And we don't need to bother them with information about plugins and what are extension points if they're just installing it. So that's one idea that we might be able to implement. And at the moment, our site setup doesn't support that, but we could change that, of course. And there are some ideas out there from smart people who build plugins for the toolkit. Several of them are in the room. One of them I have the pleasure of working with on the DITA Bootstrap plugins. Jason Fox and I work on those together. And Jason has put a lot of effort into that, and he's going to talk about that later today, so I don't want to steal Jason's thunder. He will tell you all about the new things that he's added there. But one thing that he's added recently that I just want to highlight is this very idea of taking the top level sections of a documentation set and putting them up in a menu at the top to say, okay, hey, these are our main sections. And then within those sections, you see the content only in the navigation sidebar of that particular section. Now, of course, our documentation isn't set up for that right now, so it doesn't work well. But if I take a version of Jason's plugin and build our documentation set with that now, we see kind of like the proof of concept. Now, that menu up there at the top now is way too complicated. There's too many entries. But if we imagine that we were to simplify that top-level structure to say something like installing, building, authoring, output, something like that, and then the navigation within there would be a little bit simpler, right? If we go to the building section, it's a bit simpler. We go to the outputs formats, it's a bit simpler. If we go to the parameters section, it's simpler. So this is an idea. I'm not promising that we'll do this. I just want to float the idea in a room full of people that might actually use our documentation. And whenever you're building software, it's really important to talk to your users. So I'm basically here to ask you, do you think this is a good use of our time? Would this be helpful? Would people find this useful? Or do you think it's a really bad idea and you like it the way it is? I don't know. Any ideas?
I think it would be useful. Yeah.
Some people think it would be useful. Okay, that's good. That's very friendly of you. Those of you who think it's a horrible idea, just stay quiet to be polite, or
You could always produce a redline version afterwards.
yes, of course. Yeah, if we had one of those plugin vendors that knew how to do that, we could produce a redline version afterward. Right? Yes. Who knows? Maybe it's a configurable option. I would like to see it the old way. I would like to see it the new way. We'll see. But yeah, I'm also just here to ask those of you that work with our documentation for the plugins that you build and the commercial tools that you build, or just at your day job at work, what parts of the documentation do you access most often?
Reference.
Reference? Yeah? Okay. What are you looking up in the reference, Elliot?
Parameters.
Parameters, yeah? Okay. That is actually one reason why this parameters topic is at the top level itself and not hidden under reference, is because we thought at some point, well, it's a parameter reference, it should be under reference. And then everyone said, no, that's the one thing I look at all the time, I want it on top. So we left it on top. Anyone else? What parts of the documentation do you find yourself clicking through most often?
Building output options. Building output.
Building output options, okay, yep. So that's good, that's good.
Release notes.
Yes? Oh, that's good. I'm glad that someone actually reads those. Great.
Why is this broken?
Why, yes. Why is this broken will be a top level topic, yes.
Or put more, has this been fixed?
Yeah.
Release I can't move to yet.
Right, yep, okay, got it. Got it. Okay, so why is this broken and has this been fixed will definitely be two new top level topics. Yep, okay, great. All right, we were ahead of schedule when I started, so I think we should leave it at that. Anyone else have any questions? Otherwise, we'll be around all day. Okay, thank you.